remarks, I would like to invite Professor Payal Arora for her concluding remarks.
Yes, hi. And I know everybody's at that, wit's end because this is a marathon of ideas and a lot to digest. So I'll try not to be as painful as possible, but I really appreciate all this energy and intellectual input. So, I'm not going to do the sort of mundanity of like summarizing because that would lead to all of you killing me if you could in person. But what I would like to do is be a little provocative and see how we can take this forwards. For example, one of the core things is we talk about, this old adage is about customers always right? And, of course, over the decades, particularly those in India who've seen a transformation of the economy and the liberalization and its benefits, the idea of putting customer at the center was a radical idea in those times, right? I mean, there was this idea that, yes, it is important to listen to citizens and their needs and, treat them as legitimate customers. However, in the last decades, what's happened is we have a disproportionate emphasis on consumption. And we see this across sectors, right? For like how it has really improved the consumption, whether it's in the artisanal economy. So look at the choices we have in terms of music, the arts. I mean, we are really at the pinnacle, shall we say, of consumption, of artistic output. Or say, look at the ride-hailing, where you can actually finally not be victims of these, old traditional taxi lobbies, and you have the freedom as a customer to choose, to rate, to like sort of like put your little 2 cents in, right? This whole crowd intelligence and collectivities of intelligence. So celebrating masses and citizens for their collective voices. So what FemLab's doing is we're not trying to do either or, that we are customer against worker. That's one of the dichotomies we really need to break away, as we tend to, as it comes up again and again, is that we need to find a way of having a dialogue which is not pitting customer against the laborer. And so I think one of the energies that we've diverted is clearly from consumption, we've shifted to the production model, right? So which means then we're not talking only about efficiency. So when the pandemic hit, there was a huge panic about the global supply chain and how to, really rethink resiliency. But the resiliency was defined by consumption. Let's not create like interruptions in the consumption chain. Not about the fact that the bottom of the pyramid, bottom of the supply chain were being even more dehumanized, were even more, alienated, were bearing extraordinary brunt of the post-pandemic situation, right? So this is part of it. And and in a sense, one can even question, it's like when we take a context like Hyderabad, so what does that actually mean? Can we speak about across India? Can we speak in global terms? And of course we can. So when we look at this rich ethnographic data, what we really are arguing is that the local is intrinsically global, because that is the normative, right? The normative is the majority of the world is facing these situations because platforms have become intrinsically globalized. Right? These practices and consumption in many ways have become globalized. And so why can't we, and why do we still ask, how does this local inform the global? Why can't we decenter it and say that this local is the global? Because it pushes the race to the bottom. And this is really a part of what FemLab's like, at least trying to do in terms of shift that kind of sort of mentality, away from the dichotomy. And this leads to the next aspect, is why feminist approaches. So this is very much in that ethos, right? When we talk about whose values count is to do with the, values and design, right? Because we're also talking about the whole platformization. Is what we need to ask is who is valued and what is valued in society, right? So the idea is that let's start to rethink value in a way. Is it really individualistic? Say Upasana's brought up, or can we recognize that there is collectivities that are actually nurturing society? And we need to think about ways in which remuneration is collectively distributed, shared value, not just shareholders, right? So somehow we are perfectly fine in shareholders as a notion, right? And collectivities on the top, but not necessarily at the bottom, because that seems to kumbaya and so marginalized, right? So, I mean, it's another sort of a point of pushback. So, again, another kind of conversation that kept coming up again and again is, why women workers, the gender, right? And so feminist approaches does not mean gender only centricism, right? The idea of why we chose women workers is just feasibility, because you have a population, a group, which is intersecting with low income, because across all sectors, these are low income and also alienated in many ways in terms of agency, power, informality, precarity, and it intersects in ways, whether, as Manisha brought up, income is a huge marker. That's why we actually chose low income populations, because income absolutely is. You could be an upper caste Brahmin woman and have far more, you may not actually relate to these realities at all, versus say a low income Muslim, driver, right? So we are not saying that gender is a way to go about it, but what we're saying is, if we look at women workers at the bottom of the pyramid, the bottom of the global supply chain, and we attend to their needs and wants and their aspirations and their tactics, there's a very high likelihood that the recommendations we come from legal contracts to design interventions to social innovations and reimagining and reforms will be good for all. So, if we recenter, so that's a sort of decolonial approach to feminism and design, right? And that's really the essentiality, is that visibility is about, not just representation and sort of tokenism, but meaningful participation, and not putting the onus on these collectives that they need to resolve it. So sure, I think it was very well legitimate questions about what are they going to do with the data? There's this notion is that should they mean the marginalized majority, be responsible for their plight? Should we put that whole responsibility on their shoulders and say, hey, good for you, come together and exercise your agency? Actually not. That's where I think we need to think about what can we create in terms of a civility today, in terms of the way in which we work, we play, we live in today's society, which becomes normative. It's a civil way of being, the future of work, for the 21st century, where people don't need to reinvent the wheel, need to fight the fight at every single local context, right? That's why we have rights. I mean, it's in fact one of the best innovations of thinking collectively of what, people together should aspire to, should take for granted. And I think I think the pandemic provides a sort of silver lining of saying, we need to bring that alive, right? And to start to see what is something which is unacceptable. So, it also puts the care economy over the efficiency. Efficiency is not a negative word per se, but it should not be in isolation and not the be all end all. Of course, efficiency is important. Again, not a dichotomy of either or, but care work where that's centered, where it is humanizing the labor practices. It is looking at equity, that women need more access to toilets. There are more toilets for men, or places at times of flexibility, so there's a lot of needs which are specific to different populations. And can we have an equitable approach, for example? And the politics of refusal, which is not penalizing, right? So, and then about the automation, right? When we talk about automation, we speak often in terms of either its efficiency and celebrate in the future of work, right? So it's almost like an understood, like it's inevitable, right? But what if we were to turn it around and think about default mechanisms? So a default in terms of care-based values as defaults in design systems and institutional values, right? And we would have a very nuanced but different kind of outlook in putting automation against defaults of care, right? And in terms of collectivities, like I said, there's a lot of the way in which it's framed when it comes from the bottom, it seems like it is very informal and we need to structure it, right? But as even Amulya argues, it's like there's a reason why certain sustains in that informal space of the whisper networks, etc. There's a role for informality. It's not that every aspect of it needs to be formalized. Also, that which is formalized, we better be very careful about what we structure in, because precarity has been long structured as the normative. It is the system, right? So we have to, as we translate these into structured and sort of sustainable designs, we need to question, what are we embedding as the values for the future, and what do we want? And we recognize one of the things across sectors that come up is workers do appreciate that flexibility, for example, but it's not at the price of security. So again, it's like we need to, can we approach a nuance that, they want flexibility, so why should we then provide them security? And it's almost, we understand, and then we have invest our energies in that debate of flexibility versus security. So can we, as academics, as thinkers, as practitioners, change the way in which we dialogue about these supposed, debates? And once we change that, we will actually just start to bring our energies together to come up with much more vibrant solutions. And I think the last point I want to end with is about the platform economy. We focus a lot about gig work, the gig platforms, like platforms designed for work. But we know in this extraordinary rising unemployment around the world, is platforms which are not necessarily marked for work is becoming spaces for work, right? So we need to broaden our understandings of where do people actually work? What are the spaces, the materiality of it, right? That they may be at home, say if you're an artisanal worker at home, and what kind of, China brings up about the chair and the symbolism of this sense of ownership and feeling that you belong in a workspace. And who, so it's the talent pool on the top of the pyramid is constantly being, catered to as a sense of belonging, like the Google campuses, like come and feel at home and never leave, right? And then you have the opposite end where you're like, please never feel at home, right? Because you are disposable, because in case by chance you get into a routine, you may just collectivize, you may just form the whisper networks and those kinds of solidarities, which could be, against the form of unionizations, etc. So I think that actually is very essential. And, I think lastly, with platforms, we also need to see the intersection with other kinds of platforms like fintech platforms, the financial scapes, and the institutional scapes, and the variety of stakeholders that we've been trying to embed in our approach, which makes it undoubtedly very messy, and it takes extraordinary amount of detail for us to, as FemLab research, teams, we spend so much time illustrating the data itself that we don't even get to the point of how do we take that further, because we believe in the nuance, we believe in the detail, because so much theorization today is taking place in the abstract, and abstraction becomes reductionistic in a sense. And we're trying to bring back that extraordinary, excruciating detail so we can then make really implementable policies, contracts, design interventions, which are not grand revolutions, but incremental, humble, which could maybe you don't have to get penalized when you decline a right, for example, to that extent. So, and I think in that regard, we may just see our work translate into the industry, and that's, I think, what we are hoping for. So with that, I will again thank you all. And really, it is such an honor for us from FemLab to be engaging with MICA's team, because you all have put so much energy and genuine thought, and you've actually really challenged us. So I think we're going to come together and push this forward, and thankfully, because of much of your intellectual input. So very much appreciated.
Thank you, Professor Payal. You gave us a lot of critical thoughts to think about the future of work.